Hey, what's happening, everybody? I wanted to introduce to you guys Clinton Ignatov. He was my guest on the eighth episode of the Rooster's Crow podcast. Had a wide-ranging conversation with Clinton. He's a very sharp guy. He's got a deep passion for computer hardware and computer environments, not just the software and not just the kind of user interfaces. He's his passion for deep learning in terms of computing and what that is and how it affects society. We have a shared appreciation for McLuhan, which brought us together. So we used a lot of McLuhan's concepts in exploring many different areas: politics, history, science, philosophy, metaphysics, metapolitics. I mean, wide-ranging discussion. We talked about Jonathan Peugeot, John Vervaeke's concept of relevance realization. We talked about Wyndham Lewis. We talked about scripture, the role of art, and the role of anti-environments in art to point to the environment that is usually received in the background. So a lot of good different ways this conversation went. I appreciate Clinton very much for joining me, and I will have him on again. Check out for some of his links in the description. And here you go. I bring to you guys Clinton Ignatov. All right, Clinton Ignatov. Thank you for joining me. I appreciate your time, sir.
Happy to be here, James.
Well, we were just talking a little bit about before, and before we kind of get, into the questions and the discussion here. You're from Canada, right?
Yep, Ontario, born and raised.
What's in the water up there? Like, McLuhan was from Canada. Jonathan Peugeot, someone we both appreciate. He's from Canada, and John Vervaeke. Like what? And I think McLuhan talks about this idea of like you have this ability to peer over the fence in terms of looking at America without being in it. What's going on there?
Yeah. If we defer to his opinion, Canada is the borderline case. So a bit of identity issue, being awash in American culture while being outside of it. Yeah, definitely. Also, we're not as cosmopolitan, I don't think. There's a few cities, but also there's a lot more country involvement in our national dialogue. So
Yeah.
we're not swamped by the coasts as perhaps
Yeah.
Americans are.
All right. It's a good way to put it. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting stuff coming from that area. I've been engaging with a lot of it on this little corner of the internet. And that's kind of where we found each other. What kind of brought us together was McLuhan. And I think you watched my episode interviewing Andrew McLuhan, and that's what kind of made you reach out, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I guess the best entry point here is you can give us a little bit of background, about your upbringing, kind of who you are and how your upbringing and your intellectual path led you to McLuhan.
Oh, great. Yes. So I was born in this, or I grew up in a small town, Angus, Ontario, and my mother and sister had to read with the phonics program, extracurricular outside of school, and I think constantly deferring to the dictionary for every single word. It's a habit. I look up 5 words a day, so that's probably the number one basis for just my for my approach to everything is to defer to understanding language precisely. Anyway, that was all well and good. We got a computer early, albeit a really old one. So I grew up with DOS and all this stuff. I really fell into it, got obsessed, so to speak. Became an early internet junkie, dial-up internet when I was in like grade 7 or 8. I'd get up at 4 a.m. and read fark.com or something, right? So I've been intrinsically a part of internet culture for a very long time, as long as I could have been. So those two things definitely, while it led to a neglect of the more of the social life, I also was just exposed to a whole bunch of stuff that had very little was not at all represented on, say, television or in my real life. So kind of a dreamy sort of kid growing up, spaced out a little bit.
You have
So that's all
siblings?
well. Yes. I have a sister who's a accomplished 2D animator, actually. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
So lots of lots of creativity in the family in that regard. But yeah, another element I'd say of growing up, which had an impact on this, is my dad's do-it-yourself approach to everything. His own mechanic, does his own home repair, builds everything, right? You have to understand and research and take control of your material world yourself, right? He's an avionics technician, so an electrician for airplanes, right? So I was, soldering stuff and, very hands-on material, involved with, in McLuhan's generalized terms, all the media, which make up our material world, right? So this kind of has today put me at odds with the idea of deferring to experts to everything. If you can go research something yourself, if you have the internet, and if you've got the hands-on experience, and if you're not afraid to mess up and play around and get dirty, then you're entitled to maybe form your own opinions on things. And sometimes those come at odds with the socially constructed, culturally held values of the day, which McLuhan would point out largely come from marketers who are just trying to make you feel inadequate and disempower you, so as you have to throw money at them to buy their services to help you out, right? So all these things would probably just lead up to my involvement with McLuhan was largely me being fed up looking at contemporary discourse about social media and the internet and flame wars and culture and philosophy, which all seem to disregard the massive impact which the internet had on society today. And so I was looking for a few years to try to explain, right, this idea of what the internet is and the impact that it has on contemporary events, which are more often described as something happening in academia or something happening in big tech, right? Silicon Valley did this, or my university professor said this, and this is what, and that was the upstream. It still is the upstream, which is described as we're being downstream of, we're being awashed with all the problems in academia, or we're downstream of the problems in big tech, or we're downstream of the problems of big media, right? And I see things completely differently. We're all downstream of the conversations on the internet. Those institutions are downstream of everyone chilling in the evening, having a conversation in the comments section, and right. So once I read McLuhan, it blew my mind. I fell right into it because he affords us this language to talk about media in a very fresh sort of way. So I've been pursuing that for a good 3-4 years. I got a hold of Andrew McLuhan, great guy. He really helped me out. He so being in Ottawa, that positions me to read things in the National Archives, whatnot. So I've kind of made it my thing.
Yeah, fascinating. Thanks for sharing that. It what kind of popped up for me is how your dad kind of highly affected the way that you look at the world, right? And how the son is an expression of the father in a sense, and that he gave you the tools to intuitively look at the environment, look at the form rather than the content. And you see everybody looking at the content, whether it's academia or big tech and whatever, and just continuously entrained on these images that keep coming in front of us. You're trying to look at the substructure. And we talked a little bit about before how your interest is in, computers, how they operate, technically, how they operate on human beings. And it's interesting how your dad had this do-it-yourself approach, which kind of led you to kind of where you're at now. You want to tell us a little bit how your interest in computers are informed by McLuhan?
Certainly. So we had Mac computers in elementary school. So grade, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We had these Macintosh computers. But then at home, I got this old DOS 486 computer. And then, finally, I got Windows 95 in the year 1999. And finally, I got Windows 98 in the year 2002. Right? Always behind the curve, but that's kind of gives you a broader historical context, right?
How old are you? How old are you?
I'm 32.
Okay.
I was born in 88. Say that. Okay. So the idea is that for me is that I jumped ship to Linux and free software, GNU Linux, properly speaking. So you have to build your operating system from scratch. So I'm like 15 years old using a very difficult to use operating system, Gen 2, that you have to build everything from the source code from scratch. You have to do it all by hand, and it took me 3 weeks to build my computer finally up to where I had a mouse and I could see graphics on the screen, right? Building it all
Mm-hmm.
from scratch, right? So this very involved sense which gets beneath the shell of Windows, right? So this gives me a really different perspective on computers from lots of people, albeit I'm not quite qualified to go work, um, you know, as a computer expert somewhere, because it was just a hobby, right? I'm not dedicated to it. I'm not a master of it. I just fiddled around, figured something out, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when I found McLuhan, the immediate resonance for me was the differentiation between content and media, because lots of people talk about Twitter as a medium or smartphones as a medium, or a word processor as a medium, and that didn't get deep enough in the conversation. I'm looking at the microcomputer, the programmable computer, as the medium. And in the early 80s, in 1984 actually, when Steve Jobs revealed the Macintosh to the world, he sort of killed the idea of you buy a computer to program it. But it's still true that you can program your computer, right? But computers were these devices that you bought, and they were programmable, and they were an extension of your logical faculties. You could take some logical process in your head, program it into a computer, and then it does it for you automatically. That's what they were in the late 70s, early
Mm-hmm.
80s. And then they still are that, but that's
Mm-hmm.
very much the minority view. Today computers are high level commodities. So that's how, that immediate content media differentiation is the thing that immediately pulled me into trying to, as McLuhan says, the artist's job is to show us what our world is made of. So I
Mm-hmm.
spent a number of months going through old computer documentaries looking for the human story of how computers became what they are from what they were, as I've described them. I've made 3 installments of Silicon and Charybdis so far, which is the name of my documentary series. There's a few more half edited, but trying to penetrate what's called the computer stack from the top all the way to the bottom, which is hard to do with a Macintosh computer or with a PC running Windows. But it's the whole reason people run free software like GNU Linux, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even though they're the minority, and most of them have a job running a web server for a company somewhere, right? And no one else in the company even understands the esoteric nature of computing, right? Computers have become so esoteric and hard to understand for most people that we've lost sight of them as the programmable medium. I hope that answers your question.
No, I think it's a super fascinating space to be in. And it made me think this idea that McLuhan says the form of a new media, the content of a new media is the form of the previous media, right? So the content of television is books, the content or the content of movies is books, the content of television is movies, right? And we're always looking at the old medium through through these new technologies. You're trying to kind of get ahead of that instead of focusing of what's on the screen in front of us now, trying to kind of ascertain the form of the media in the present, which I think is an interesting place to be. And that kind of brings up this question about would computing technology is based on binary zeros and ones, right? But would the computer be possible without the phonetic alphabet?
Oh no, nothing would. Machines themselves are as they become complicated, they become these holistic all at once processes. But all of our machines grow out of linear step by step thinking and processes, right?
Yeah.
It's only gradually that they become complicated. And Eric Havelock of the Toronto School, in his preface to Plato, lays out how Aristotle and Plato were influenced by the phonetic alphabet, precisely the phonetic alphabet, which sort of takes our spoken word and freezes it into these lines, sort of instills this ability for us to think logically. How Aristotle develops the syllogism, right?
Mm-hmm.
If this and this, then that, right? So, and machines are like physical instantiations
Mm-hmm.
of logic, of syllogisms, of a domino, right? If I flick this domino, it will hit that domino. It will hit that domino. So if you want to look at industrialism arising during the Enlightenment in the past, 500 years, then you're looking at the story of logic becoming instantiated in matter from the human mind into clockwork.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
You can take complex machines and find out their constituent parts reduced down to their linear logical nature, all owing from the linear nature of a line of text.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. And I wonder if there's an interesting correlation to be made with the difficulties of quantum computing. And the reason I ask that is because language prior to the phonetic alphabet and letters were highly symbolic, whether it's hieroglyphs or the ideogram or the Hebrew letters, right? They were connected in terms of meaning to their environment and to the world. And McLuhan talks about the alphabet as being like a set of teeth, right? That just crunches and chomps and chews on and everything. And it made me think of the logos, right? It's like we've captured the logos and we've captured it in this rational way, and it's been denuded of its broader effects. And we're just, focused on this kind of machinic way of thinking and being and understanding. And that's eventually, as the tools we use end up using us, we're eventually being turned into this machinic part of the logos that we're hyper focused on. It's like, what is, when you say machine, what exactly do you mean? I know you said like clockwork, because I saw in your blog post, you talked about we all live inside of a machine. What do you mean exactly by that?
Right. I like to think of our civilizational inheritance as being the total environment which we built up against nature. So as you're reading the laws of media there, you'll see how Eric and Marshall McLuhan are very explicit that the tetrad applies to human-made devices or technologies, starting all the way back with the spoken word, right?
Mm-hmm.
And arrowheads, let's say, right? Houses and stones and bricks and right. So the history of civilization is the history of humans externalizing themselves into the world, right? The natural world becomes raw material for creating, buttressing us, shielding us from all the vicissitudes of nature and all the Darwinian processes, and we can kind of live in our human-made world against nature.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think of all of that as one machine, as opposed to looking at every little part as a new invention, right, then our total world, the house I'm in, the streets, everything, going up to Sputnik, the satellite, and the GPS system which surrounds us is all sort of our anti-environment to brutal animalistic nature at large, our shelter from it. So when I say machine, I'm trying to include all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at a machine abstractly, just in like how it works as an abstract mechanism, you sort of lose the human origins
Mm-hmm.
of it within, 20 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, there were real people struggling to create these structures and create these meanings and create devices and create things for a specific purpose
Mm-hmm.
that became ubiquitous and became environmental and we take for granted today, right? There's layers and layers and layers, requiring precisely the archaeological approach that McLuhan is innovating. Taking from the people who influenced him, Siegfried Gideon especially, the idea of anonymous history, the idea that all of our devices share the same structure as human spoken language, insofar as they have poetic meaning. And if you read, say, industrial designers like the Bauhaus from the early, right, people who design our products, product designers, and right, they're all trying to give things enough human meaning and influence that they'll catch on and that they'll be useful, but that they also have functionality and form, right?
Like a
It's
car commercial, right? A car commercial that gives you like some philosophical snippet. It says nothing about the car, right?
yeah.
And it's nothing about the performance of the car or, safety. It's just about, take hold of your life, reimagine possibilities. And it's just like the most superficial thing,
Oh, sure. We all assume that we're that we are looking for the practical reasons to make a purchase, and that marketing tricks don't work on us. But that's always on a specific by specific level. So you go and you buy Consumer Report magazine, and you go and you look at the gas mileage of the car as done in some tests to be an informed consumer. But then the overall entire environment of why do I live this far away from a highway, and why does this highway go here, and why is there a traffic jam over there, and so why do I care about gas mileage? The total environment has a much more impact on us than the particular of the buying decision, right? So there's all these ways in which we're susceptible to taking for granted the formal cause of everything when we're trying to act all logical on the particulars.
Yeah, that's it just brought up a couple things. First of all, like just to talk a little bit more, I think it gets particularly pernicious when you see in the United States. I don't know if it's allowed in Canada, but we have tons and tons of pharmaceutical commercials, tons and tons of them all the time, and they make my blood boil. My wife's like, just don't watch them, which I don't, but they make me react. So there's something there. And I was watching it with a friend, and they're talking about whether it's your depression, it's a pill for your depression that's not working because of the pill that you have. So it's like a stack on the depressive pill, which I'm not saying depression is not a real thing, and pharmaceuticals work for people. That's not what I'm saying at all. But it had and then at the end of it, you have this silent music, you have a butterfly floating, and then it talks about these side effects, which are, may cause death, may cause, anal leakage, all this crazy stuff. And my friend's like, why would anybody buy a medication when you have all those side effects there? And it's like, because if somebody's emotionally attached to a disease that they have, whether it's depression, those side effects are meaningless. Oh, this thing can help me. Doesn't matter what they say, and that's why, the pharmaceutical companies were forced to put the side effects on their commercial, and they have this guy with a nice little voice, may cause this, you know what I'm saying? It's like, it's just, I don't know. What do you feel in terms of advertising with something like the pharmaceutical industry?
You said emotional attachment to depression, which I think is really worth fleshing out a little bit, because those words precisely capture our nature of identity within the terms we're given to understand ourselves. And we resort to machine metaphors to understand our own human condition. This is sort of the most glaring effect of what you could say. We make our machines, then our machines make us, or what have you. So you can read McLuhan in the 40s complaining about machine metaphors like two people being compatible with each other, right? We got divorced because we're not compatible, right? He's like, well, machines are compatible, right? People aren't compatible. That's baloney, right? Or all this language which comes so naturally us to today was so glaringly roboticizing people in the industrial age. Of course, Freud talking about our drives and the buildup of pressures as contemporary to the steam engine. And now, if you watch John Vervaeke, although he constantly is qualifying his language by saying, we shouldn't think of ourselves as machines, and then in the next sentence he'll say, we're processing information, like sensory information, right? You can't escape these metaphors that we use, right? We're always trying to turn the brain into our latest gadget, and especially pernicious is the fact that now we often use language which draws on our black box idea of computers, which is given to us, where like computers have a magic space inside of them where information processing happens, and information is this substance that flows across wires, and I send you an email and your data is coming to me, right? There isn't actually this like ephemeral substance called information that flows around like a ghost or an ether. That, right, information doesn't actually exist. Right, just when you measure stuff and you turn it into math, and then you process and then you do some math, right, it's easy to think of it as like a substance which exists inside your computer, and that projection only exists in the absence of you seeing your computer as a physical machine of a bunch of circuits blinking on and off according to a clock, right? So the metaphors that people have today, and especially in psychopharmacology, of I need to get, this is a lot more, I'm hearing this language less and less, but I was really struck 10 years ago. It sort of turned me off of the term chemical imbalance. Oh, I've just got a chemical imbalance. So it's like I'm a puppet with a couple different neurotransmitters that I gotta check the fluid levels on my, right? It's like you pull out the dipstick and you check the fluid levels. Oh, I'm a little low, right? Pop up that one, right? Blah, 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 right? So as long as I can control my mood, as long as I keep my various receptors regulated, right? This and that and the other thing. It's a and I'm not trying to like anybody who's listening might find might interpret what I'm saying as being anti-psychiatric or whatnot, and I don't want to take anyone away from what their doctor is, the discussion between them and their doctor. I have to qualify that up front. Nevertheless, it's I'm saying all this as an example of how our ideas of ourselves are constantly changing, and how science sort of becomes this whatever you want to, whenever people want to justify their machinic view of human nature, they just resort to science in the abstract. Well, science says this is true. Well, yes, it's true. You do have dopamine and serotonin. You do have all these things, but those are not the one true, well, because science says that's true first and foremost. So I should think of myself this way first and foremost, and everything else is woo and superstitious nonsense or unscientific, or Freud was a quack, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's a very poor, I think that's a poor way to look at yourself and other people if you strive to understand all the different modes of thought and all the different cultures and all the different traditions in the world, right?
Yeah, it's like you're right. It's not wrong that there is an imbalance in the neurochemistry in your brain that's causing certain emotions, right? But the idea is, okay, why is there an imbalance, right? You peel back even further, right? Like the problem, I think, is not the fact that there are neurochemicals in our brain. The problem is reducing our identity to those neurochemicals. Like there was this documentary where they said that they found the reason humans have religion and God. And there was this part of the brain, they had a helmet that was developed. And this part of your brain that once stimulated, it stimulates kind of mystical experiences or experiences of God or experience of the transcendent. So it's like, see, it's nothing. It's just a brain state that's located in this part of the brain. It's like, but why would you assume that it's reduced to that? And I think it's from your insight here of how we're these machine metaphors, we're inside the machine. We're literally being digested by the machine, right? And we're using the metaphors because they're running through our being. All right. And you said something interesting about information. I think of the word information, information, right? Information is that which informs, which gives cohesion, which gives embodiment to whatever situation, whether civilization or company or whatever it may be. We're in this weird space of disinformation. So disinformation, right, has the inverse effect of information. And you said information isn't real. What is information?
Right. Excellent. I'm wondering how deeply into this we can go. We can go very deep into that question.
We got our floaties on. Let's wade in that deep end.
First and foremost, what I've been trying to do largely is go read the academic texts on all these topics, which are in fact being taught in university classrooms today on all these questions, because I want to know where academia is at, right, on these subjects as I approach them, perhaps obliquely. So there's a book which is often N. Catherine Hale's book, How We Became Post-Human. Excellent book. Begins with cybernetics, and you think of machine gunners in late World War II who are being told exactly where to shoot in the sky to lead the enemy aircraft, so that by the time their munitions make it up in the sky and explode, it explodes right where the plane is going to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that all relies on real-time information processing by a computer, which predicts, okay, you know, the shell is going to take 20 seconds to make it to this altitude, so fire at this angle so that by the time that plane over there, right, you understand, interception. And so the gunners exist inside of this Newtonian cybernetic space, which is being rendered by this machine. Right, all the planes in the sky are data points within the projective information space, because the computer is set up to represent 3D space. And so there's this little simulation of the sky and the ground and where the gun is being processed and mathematically figured out. It spits out a number, right? Aim over here, fire now, right? And so the gunner, where is the gunner who pushes the button that launches the shell, which takes out the enemy airplane, right? They're living within the space inside the computer. So they become part of the machine, right? The gun exists as a physical material, actual object shooting in a physical material plane, but the headspace of the gunner is living inside this abstract concept, which is built up of basic fundamental math being processed very quickly on this computer. You know, like 1940s computer full of, like, you know, vacuum tubes and stuff. This is the size of a you know, a small building, whatever, right? So this is sort of where information as a material, like a real material in which we can embody within the simulated space, sort of becomes this more and more powerful, right? Once peacetime comes around, IBM is like, how the hell do we use this awesome ability for us, you know, at every level of society, right? And they create what Baudrillard might, you know, consider, you know, simulations and whatnot, and then those replace the real, and we live in a simulacrum, etc., etc. I understand you studied lots of postmodernism in university, right?
Yes, yeah. Cut my teeth on that mostly. Yeah.
So I'm not sure how much the actual material technical inspiration for lots of postmodern theory is stressed in the contemporary you know, a school curriculum about postmodernism, in which you were educated in formally, right? But the way McLuhan puts it, you can draw a straight line backwards through the modern artists in his favorite four, right? T.S. Eliot, Wyndham Lewis, Ezra Pound, and James Joyce, back through the French symbolists, Mallarmé, right? That's the interesting thing, is that the history of ideas as taught in philosophy, it's sort of like as though all of continental Europe traveled through the brains of Kant and were formatted by Kant, and then we all traveled through the brains of Hegel, and then now everyone is a Hegelian, as though everyone in Europe sat down and read Hegel or somehow and fashioned themselves off that idea, and then everyone went through Marx, and then everyone went through Nietzsche, and then everyone went through Freud. Right? This history of ideas is leapfrogging. McLuhan has this entirely different pathway of thought and intellectualism and mode of being through his arts criticism. He's looking at, you know, we went through Wordsworth, and then we went through Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and then France went through these poets, and then the English went through these poets, right? He's got this entirely different path through the Enlightenment era, and well, not just the Enlightenment era. He goes all the way back, you know, through Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and you know, all this stuff, right? So that's why he's sort of out in his own world, looking at everything from these unfamiliar eyes. right, his idea of our historical inheritance, or our cultural inheritance, travels through art, not the
Mm-hmm.
philosophy of thinkers, say through German idealism, right? So
Well,
so
wouldn't that
that's
be
what
a form of art? It's a human
certainly
artifact, right?
it
Like,
certainly is, but the history of ideas, sort of, let's look at ideas in that context as the precursor to what I'm describing as information.
mm-hmm.
If I go and I try to study what Immanuel Kant said I was made of, right, in this abstract sense of I'm an a priori synthesis, right,
Mm-hmm.
blah 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 blah, right. Newton had an idea, and you go study his ideas, and you learn these concepts, and you project them onto your world, and now you're living in Newtonian space, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're thinking, oh wow, there really is just three spatial dimensions, and they change over time, and gravity pulls me down, and inertia goes this far, blah 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 blah, right? So Newton had an idea, a concept, right? And it's like a closed, I'm not sure if that's, if, well, it's this interworking system of what material reality is, the end. And everyone takes the information from Isaac Newton and puts it on, and then they start being able to see the potential to create machines, and to create industry, and to create clocks, and to create pulleys and lever, right?
Mm-hmm.
The entire world builds up. Industrialization happens because in a world as Isaac Newton described it, you can create things according to his rules, and they work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now that you have laws for how inertia works, for all this stuff, right? You just do the math on paper, and you take these abstract concepts on paper, which are information, and you project them out in the real world, and holy crap, my machine runs, it's alive, right? We've imbued the material world with this animism, we are like gods creating, right, all this stuff, right? And then Kant kind of kicks over that sandcastle in his own way. I'm a very half learned philosopher, so I'm sort of out of my depth in describing philosophy in any detail, but I understand that's the story, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now we live in this post-Newtonian space, and then Einstein comes along, and Minkowski, and now the material world isn't even real anymore, and time isn't even real anymore, and in the way that it used to be understood, etc., etc. So it's like, where the hell are we, right? That's the origins of Vervaeke's meaning crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's largely owing to, I think, the way that we implicitly reify information or ideas or concepts as this sort of substance which is passed down, divorced from our material embodied relationship to our material embodied world as this total system that we've inherited to abstract ourselves against nature.
Mm-hmm.
So
So what do you mean?
insofar as
What do you
go
mean
ahead.
by what do you mean by nature? And just I think that was great. I think you got it pretty much spot on. And then you had Descartes who internalized the self into the I think, therefore I am. And it's interesting, that they lay out, they've laid out this big material grid to apply to the world. And when we applied it, it works. It's useful. So it's got a utility to it. So where it is the information that they are providing, human civilization that we then appropriate. Where is it coming from? Where's that information coming from? Where those ideas come from? If they're not, they're not processing units like in a CPU, right? So when Descartes and Newton, they were intuiting this way of looking at the world, which was extremely useful. Where did those ideas come from? I'm trying to get into like what is information, and is everything a simulation on top of a simulation? Because these ideas that were channeled through Descartes and Newton, that those are just false ways or not total ways of looking at the world, and we're just using them, and then we're projecting that this is the way the world is. The idea is, where did that information come from in the first place for it to be, transposed into our world in the here and now?
If I understand your question, it might be the good time to reference the nature of symbolism.
Yes. I mean, maybe try to reformulate a little bit. So when Einstein, when he got his biggest insights, they didn't happen when he was doing the math. It happened when he was in a dream state, right? It's almost a similar question. Where does the information from dreams come from, right? Like we have the collective unconscious, and I think you're spot on in bringing it to symbolism, in a sense. We can get into a lot of different areas. In one sense, we are limited in our maturity, our spiritual maturity. So we are obtaining insights from spaces that we're not aware of, and we're filtering them through our limited cognition. We can go back to the fall and what that means, and then we're applying it to our world, and it's causing useful things. It causes utility, but it also causes disintegration in a sense. So going back to where did that information come from, and in terms of symbolism, what were you going to say?
Well, if we consider, scripture, and it's made up of narratives, and then literal thinkers want to go around and say, oh, well, the Great Flood didn't really happen, man. That's just a story. That's just a metaphor. There's no geographic, and then some fundamentalists go say, look, there was a massive flood this many years ago, and that proves the world's 6,000 years old, right? And so you got these two sides fighting over whether the Bible's literally true or not, right? And that each side is completely missing the point, right? I think we can agree. At the same time, these stories sort of give us a kernel or a foundation for us to build ourselves up on, which allows us to relate, right? These symbols in these stories connect to a whole bunch of things in our material world today, right? They give us a ground of being, which is nevertheless sort of in this space, which is rooted in something larger than our material universe in one way, or that comes from outside of, right? It's sort of, if scripture is inspired by God, it sort of gives you a basis within which to walk around and live in the world, which is rooted in something beyond the lived experience of your actual predecessors, expressed in a way that we traditionally think of today in a literal autobiographical account, right? It's sort of like the mother of pearl, which is built up as the sand grain is irritated inside of the oyster. Is it oysters or is it clams? I don't know. I'm no marine biologist.
I think it's clams. Actually, I don't know.
Right.
I think it's no, it's I don't know. It's neither here nor there.
Right. Myths are constantly told as they're retold, and they change to fit the contemporary scene. Stories are, right, if I were to tell the story of Narcissus today, to use that as an example, or the story of Medusa, I'm going to tell the story in a way which tries to relate to the subliminal effects or the stories or the problems of the world today, right? This is the way language evolves and is kept alive, and so the written scriptures are like a written down, frozen instantiation of the accrued, collective effort to tell stories which made the most sense of the world to people. Symbolism comes from the Greek term symbolene, which means to clash together. It's the same root as the actual musical cymbals, right? Smash, right? There's a whole bunch of particular elements, and you crash them together in just the right way in one symbol, and it resonates. Oh my goodness, I saw this symbol and it exploded a whole bunch of meaning, right? There's all these particulars in a certain, and this is the most important part of McLuhan, I think, is this in a certain proportion. It's not enough to put these things together. They have to be in the right proportion, as so what's small and subtle and what's big and important is all in the right collective ratio. When let's say new agers talk about achieving a balance, they've got this very binary view of proportion, where in fact, what's more important than finding a balance between, a balance between work life and home life, or a balance between good and evil, or a balance, right? All these dichotomies, they would be better off discussing the proportion of all things and their importance relative to all other things, and getting the big things big and the small things small, right? Et cetera.
What determines the right proportion? It seems like we're moving into this territory of quantity versus quality. We've been hyper focused on quantity. How do we understand this idea of quality and the right proportion in terms of understanding? And I love it. It's like a fractal. If you go too big, it becomes meaningless. If it goes too small, it becomes meaningless. And what does our science do? We get telescopes and microscopes, and we go further and further, looking at the things, the things themselves, looking for the things themselves. But when we get there, we realize it's like we're looking for, or the category is wrong in the first place, because you're looking for meaning in matter, right? The meaning is a whole separate, like from a spiritual sense, and the word symbol, means throw together. It's like where two rivers come together. It's like a watershed, but that's not just the material process come together. We've effaced this whole idea of spiritual reality. So I think, kind of what you're saying is symbolism is, it happens appropriately with the appropriate mediation of meaning and matter, of heaven and earth, of spirit and matter, right? It's like when those things come together, a confluence of a meaning happens. Like, reality exists in that space of the appropriate mediation of heaven and earth, right? And it was supposed to be man's dispensation to appropriately mediate heaven and earth, to name the animals. Adam wasn't supposed to just name the animal willy-nilly, right? It was the appropriate proportionality in terms of how to name things and how to tame the earth, in a sense. And that's gone completely haywire. So, and the stories are, Christ never wrote anything down. And the only reason that the scripture was written down is because of the sinning of the people. To sin means to miss the mark. It's an old Greek word from amartia. It's from archery. So when you're aiming and you're not aiming appropriately, you'll miss the mark. So when a society, a civilization starts missing the mark, they had to encapsulate the scripture. They had to encapsulate Christ's teaching into the scripture. And that's kind of my understanding of where the Bible came from. Like, Christ wasn't saying, hey, I'm telling you this stuff, write it down, make a Bible out of it. The whole thing was, to effect that change, that metanoia in people, right, that change of heart, in order for civilization to turn out as such, to realize the kingdom of heaven on earth, which there's so much baggage with that term right there. And that sentence I just said, it's almost impossible to really look at it in a way and ascertain what that really means. It's almost impossible to try to say, to realize heaven on earth, right? The story of the fall was that Adam and Eve, right? Adam means humanity. So it's also an individual person, but also means humanity as a whole. Eve means life, right? So humanity and life. And they were both individuals. Now it's going to, they were really individuals. We keep mapping on to our current way of looking at the world based on Newton and Descartes back into these ancient stories and say that couldn't have happened. But we're using this algorithm, to use the machine metaphor, to apply it to something that is not cognizable in that way, right? So it's hard to kind of to get back to that way of thinking. But the general story was that Adam and Eve were eventually to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? They were eventually to eat from that tree when they spiritually matured enough and ate from the tree of life. There was 2 trees in the garden, right? So we ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil without obtaining the spiritual maturity necessary to subdue the earth appropriately. So in order to intuit right proportionality, we have to have spiritual maturity. That wasn't, that wasn't attained for whatever reason. Then you have the fall and whatnot. But the idea was we were supposed to eat from the knowledge of good and evil, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And we are we're filtering the world through this fallen state. And Nietzsche is trying to get beyond good and evil, right? He's intuiting, we need to get beyond good and evil. We need to get beyond our conception of good and evil. We need to get back to, we need to have that change of heart, change in perspective, that metanoia, in order to live rightly. If we don't, we will destroy ourselves. And then from a scientific perspective, the same person that's going to say there was no flood, it's all BS, but climate change and global warming is causing the seas to melt, and we're going to be completely flooded soon. It's like, oh, really? So there's a lot there, but I think it goes back to your point of this right proportionality, and how do we determine that? How do we ascertain it? And it brings me back to the idea of relevance realization, right? How does what is relevant in the moment dawn upon you? And is that something you can cultivate? And can you cultivate relevance realization? And is that somehow play into this idea of right proportionality and looking at the world in order to get away from this hyper focus on quantity?
Absolutely, it does. It's where to begin, right?
Yeah.
I'll begin with where you ended, relevance realization. So all of the reading that I've been doing in this alternate line of thought, which again is certainly not. I mean, McLuhan was just a dude who was reading a whole bunch of books, half of which other people weren't reading, right? So he's got these alternate perspectives on history, which are grand and wonderful, and you can, but I mean, that's not. For instance, Eric Voglin. Have you heard of him?
Um, I've heard of the name, but I'm not familiar.
Yeah, he's really worth looking into because he sort of has this idea of Gnosticism, which he brings into the contemporary political terms of believing that humanity is in a fallen state and that individual actors have to take it upon itself to create heaven on earth. And he sees that within the utopian projects of contemporary politics, for instance, right? So the way he tries to tie ancient Gnosticism and contemporary politics is novel, and McLuhan got a lot from him. So McLuhan very much early on saw mankind as having fallen with industrialism. And he saw Machiavelli as teaching princes and royalty. Listen, you don't have to be a moral human being. Just, treat your subjects in your state like a machine. If people are doing this, reward them. If people are doing that, go kill them off, right? Like, forget it. That's how it's going to work. You're going to stay in power if you follow these 1, 2, 3 easy steps, right?
The ends justify the means, right?
The ends justify the means, yeah, right? And so he would, but later on, he sort of saw that as a really not a useful way for looking at, you're right, because that's the Gnostic point of view that he eventually realized, right, to see things as fallen and then we need to lift things back up to a higher state. That was really problematic for him, which is his media theory is kind of a way to cut through beneath that as a way to restore the basic faculty for relevance realization, which is necessary to just see what the heck is going on in the first place before you start making value judgments. Right, before you start deciding what's wrong with the world and how we're going to fix it. Like, do you even live in the world, or do you live within your solipsistic imaginary projection of stories and information and systems, which cuts you off from actual communication from other people? Right,
Like Neil Postman was a moralizer, right? Neil Postman took the moral kind of perspective and ran with it a little bit more.
And not wholly incorrectly, but Neil Postman definitely focused on the disservices of television, especially, and then later computers and telecommunications, on how the disservices were totally ignored. And Postman really put his finger on the button with his criticism of television evangelical super churches. And the idea of people staying home at Sunday and then watching this Protestant dude on TVs, address a giant crowd and trying to recreate the church idea, at home, and how that's nothing like communing with the people in your town, next to you in the pews, sharing in the collective spirit of the church, right? So yes, what McLuhan observed, to put it in contemporary sociological language, is he saw that the content of television was going to shortcut social constructionism into allowing people to be influenced by people on the TV screen. So there was an interesting book, which I think was formative in his shift against moralism and towards this basic project for relevance realization, proper proportionate relevance realization. So the old McLuhan was judging stuff. He had value judgments. He saw the world has fallen. The new McLuhan was like, no. Let's just get everyone seeing what's going on here. Like, I'm not here to judge anybody. Like, that's fine, right? And this book was called Foundations of Social Survival by John Lindbergh. And it's in the end of a book I know you have, The Medium and the Light. That essay, well, it's in the God-making machines of the modern world, and it's fleshed out more in Catholic Humanism and Modern Letters. But this idea that the old world, which is melting away, tried to govern our passions, tell us, to keep our passions under control, and do this and don't do that. Here's a bunch of rules for self-control, and that's how society works. And the new world, full of animated television icons, would govern us through our passions. It's like, yes, go chase your dreams and live your passions and get it all out there and seek your catharsis and live in the moment. And here's a whole bunch of role models on how you do that within the Overton window, within norms, right? We shifted to a whole bunch of role models representing the healthy norms of how people should behave. And if you deviate too far from that, you've fallen into extremism or mental illness or something, right? But as long as you live your life the same way the TV characters do on your TV screen, now it's a different way of keeping everyone together. We're all communing together, right? Space has shrunk. All time is now. Everyone lives on the set of Seinfeld and is able to now crack witty observational humor jokes. Or
and
everyone.
There's a laugh track there that tells you where to laugh, or you don't even have to laugh. It does the laughing for you, so you can just sit and observe, and you don't even worry about the laughing piece. And that brought up, I just saw a meme yesterday. Somebody posted it, said, which 90s TV family would you want to be a part of? And it had the Huxtables, it had the Full House family, it had the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air family, and it just had pictures of the family sitting there. It's like, it's exactly in line with kind of what you're saying here. And I think that I've never thought of it like that, of this kind of, we went from constraining and controlling the desires to amplifying them through this, through the advent of technology, of electric light. And I think McLuhan has this idea, is that it's a big difference from reading a book that reflects light than watching TV, which is emitting light. And he says that our children are in a real way being X-rayed when they're watching TV. So it's like, it made me think of this juxtaposition of the constraining of desires to the inflaming through literally light that's inflaming your desires in a sense, and your passions. I mean, I'm sorry to cut you off. You're going to a great space there, but passions and desires are a very interesting kind of dimension for me. And if you can kind of what are your thoughts on passions? What are they? Where do they come from?
Right. A lot of the discourse today, which is especially, if you want to look at Jordan Peterson and a lot of people who are following in his wake, or preceding Jordan Peterson was Camille Paglia, these thinkers who are deeply entrenched in the Western tradition or in scientific contemporary neuroscience, or Godsad, for instance, is another guy who's deeply entrenched in evolutionary psychology. All of these people who have built up their fort against postmodernism.
All Canadians, by the way. All Canadians. Every single one of them.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point. But all these people are right. They're anti-Lacan, anti-Derrida, anti-French post-structuralists, anti-postmodernism, right? Because reality is real. Of course, reality is real, right? Right. Like, stop saying reality doesn't real, right? Right. And yet, all the language for understanding passions and desires from within this simulation dream space within the machine, within these concepts and paradigms in which souls are lost, to employ religious language, within the materialism and within the content of our media. The post-structuralists and Jacques Lacan and these guys all had the absolute best language for describing what desire and passion and how people work within that space, right? I'm only just dipping my toes into proper Zizek, right, as a guy who's fusing Hegel and Lacan, right? And it's all, it is chaos. Who you are is negatively defined, because your ego of what you think is going on is always chasing into a gap of the unknown, and the unknown is always so much greater. And what makes you is the way your ego is always trying to run off a cliff over and over again, and falls down and builds back up and then falls on the cliff, right? Your ignorances define you more than anything that you say that right? The self as negatively defined. And so desire and like l'objet petit a, and the thing that you chase after is always this ephemeral ghost thing that once you get it didn't actually fill the hole you thought it would.
Because you're missing the mark. You're missing the mark in terms of what your desire, following those desires, right? To build an identity based off these material ephemeral desires, you're missing the mark. You're not aware of it. And Zizek talks about this voided subjectivity. We have this void within us. Lacan and Freud talked about this lack that we're continuously trying to fill. And I was like, yeah, you're right. But where does that lack come from? Why is there a hole? And why do we have to view things in terms of this negative space? And just quickly, it goes to this idea of Hegel, goes back to Hegel's dialectic, right? Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which I think of as a bastardization of the Trinity, right? And there's even this idea, and this isn't my novel idea, that, it is true that Hegel had a son that he resented because his son kept him from realizing his professional philosophical teaching duties. Like there's a specific situation that happened there. And it's like, so the idea of the dialect being thesis, antithesis, synthesis, why is the antithesis a negation? You said your father was a do-it-yourself guy, right? You didn't negate, you're not a negation of your father. You're an expression of your father, right? You took the best qualities of him, right? And that's why I think is the nature or part of what could be this idea of this voided subjectivity, because you have Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Jesus is not a negation of the Father, right? He is an expression of the Father. He's doing the Father's work, on earth to make, as it is in heaven, right? So it's this idea of the Son is an expression of the Father. The finite is an expression of the infinite, right? And it's couched in these negative terms in terms of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So what you're synthesizing, the resolution in the dialectic, is based on a negative. And then we're applying our human subjectivity based in this, that we're situated, our egos are situated in this negation. And I think they're right, that it is. And that's why marketers and corporations can just make trillions of dollars just playing off that, right? Inflaming those passions, because they know we're going to, be completely enamored and entrained in the next, the Coca-Cola, or even worse, drugs and alcohol and sex and movies and everything. All of that's doing is filling a hole that we're not aware of is there. And even the pharmaceutical industry, they're doing the same thing that advertisers are doing. In a sense, they're filling a hole that we don't know is there. And then, this is the origins, I think, of the midlife crisis, right? You get your wealth, you get your status, you get whatever, your family, whatever you use. You're not focused on building and cultivating relationships with your community and your family. You're focused on getting the next job, getting the promotion, getting the next car. Your neighbor just got a fence. You got to get a new fence. You just got a new car, right? And then once you check all those boxes, you're empty, right? So all of those things are small object A's that you're just, all of a sudden, boom, you're empty. And what do? It's literally your identity crumbles, right? Because you're building your identity on things and status. But once you get to a certain age and you realize that game was a sham, your identity crumbles. And then you just start throwing Hail Marys. I'm going to get a new sports car. I'm going to divorce. I'm going to get a new hot wife or a mistress. Because now you don't know where else to turn. And you're just throwing Hail Marys to keep your identity. So from it's crumbling around you, in a sense.
And Hail Marys is actually a fantastic metaphor in and of itself.
So it's like I don't know what the point was there, but I think it goes back to, and I think you hit it right on, and that's why Lacan and Zizek and Hegel are so attractive, because they are seemingly reflecting back to us this thing that we're not aware of. They're kind of acting like as an anti-environment, but I think they're missing the mark, in a sense. Not that I could, I'm questioning Hegel and Lacan. I don't know. Like, it's just like McLuhan, man. It goes back to, he went from value judgments to, wait, I'm filtering the world through the limited sense of good and evil, right? That is limited. So I stopped making judgments. I'm going to stop making value judgments, and I'm going to observe, right? He attained, and he had a conversion to Catholicism, right? And he read the Bible in many, many different languages. There's a lot to maybe discuss there, but it seems like, stop applying your knowledge of good and evil, no matter how accurate you think it is, to what's happening, and just observe. And that's what attracts me. That McLuhan, when I talked to Andrew, that portion of it, before, I was like, how could you not make a value judgment? Even if you're going to approach a subject, you're making a value judgment just to approach it. So how is that possible not to have a theory of communication? His theory of communication, that I don't have a theory of communication, but I get it now. And it's extremely hard to observe your environment, right? Extremely hard. If you're making value judgments of it, it's impossible. So this brings you so when you saw what happened at the Capitol and with the raiding of the Capitol, half the people are saying it was an Antifa plant, half are saying it was all Trump's fault. People more like, my inclination is, it's a psychological operation from the CIA that they're continuing to do. Don't make a judgment. If you get captured in it, if you're captured in the dream of the other, you're fucked. I think that was a Lacan's quote, right? You're always captured. So it's how do you stand back and observe when you have these lights just flashing in your eyes 24/7?
Yeah. This is the suspension of judgment. Forestalling to make a conclusion, right? You're not right. Not decide on that you've discovered the cause of anything, right? To always live in this uncertain state is extremely precarious, and everyone around you in your day-to-day life, you go to work, you go out, right? They're gonna throw their opinion at you, as a foregone conclusion, as though, of course, you're smart, so I know you agree with me. Blah 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 blah, and you got to say, oh, I don't know about that, or you humor them to get through your day or whatever, right? Concomitant or with the language of chemical imbalances. Lots of times when I'm talking to people, they'll talk about how they have to get better at compartmentalizing their day, right? So especially if bartenders, you're right, they got to go be a bartender and be friendly and talk to everyone, and they're totally not themselves at all, and they got to learn to not take work home with them, right? So there's an interesting book called The Saturated Self by Kenneth Gergen. And Kenneth Gergen sort of was a postmodernist social constructionist guy. His first book was Invitation to Social Constructionism, and he founded the Teos, or this whole organization built around everything is socially constructed. We all tell each other what's going on, and then we build up our whole perception of the world based on what everyone else said was going on, and we agree, and we live in this collective short-circuited floating dream of what we all agree is going on. And if there's consensus, then we're all part of that. And also every situation draws out a different part of us, which needn't necessarily be we can contradict ourselves through the day as opportunities demand, and we can have double standards, and we can be multiple people because we're saturated with all these archetypes, and whoever we need to be at a moment we'll pull out, and it'll fit that moment, and then melts back into our subconscious as we go be who we have to be the next moment, right? We're compartmentalized beings constantly rolling through the world. And I've seen this language echoed elsewhere by people who take up Deleuze and Guattari, right? This schizoanalytical mode of being, right? So this is what comes of this being as negation. Since you're making the positively defined self part of you up as you go along, and then the overall negative void, you'll probably fall apart, and you'll have to build a new self, and you just have to build up this palette of different disjointed selves which spring up and coalesce back on demand, right? Without an ego. Let me think.
You notice then the criticizers of postmodernism rarely, if ever, criticize Deleuze, probably because they couldn't read him or didn't read him. And I think he's an interesting character.
Yeah, he gets a lot from Bergson, right? And I happen to know that Bergson is not at all a part of the definition of postmodernism as it's being assailed by Jordan Peterson and company, which I think is a constructive criticism to make, right? Honestly, you can't dismiss Lacan as a bad psychoanalyst and leave it at that, right? There's all these things resonate for a reason. One of the elements that we'll say I inherited in this do-it-yourself mindset from my father is the idea of practicing and getting good at a trade, let's say, in the abstract. Not to say that I'm a tradesman per se, but I can hammer something together if I have to, or if something's broken, I'll fix my own appliances. Thank you very much, right? It's right. Everyone's terrified of screwdrivers and the Tim the Toolman Taylor archetype of the klutzy do-it-yourself guy who always explodes whatever the hell he's working on. Is one expression of society's general aversion to not trusting your Maytag repairman to do all the work for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it was easy for me to sort of be present in the here and now because I feel a sense of control and mastery over my immediate environment. There's a couple terms which are useful to think about. They have multiple definitions, but if you think about it, their definitions are actually the same, just complementary insofar as our relation to our environment. One of them is habit, right? So there's like, what are the multiple definitions of habit, James, that come to mind for you?
Yeah, it's it's interesting that habit is how we construct our identity, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you use drugs all the time, you develop a habit, you become a drug addict. If you have a habit of practicing football every day of your life, right, that habit will turn into a football player, a high school football player. If you have the habit of going to church, right, that habitual process will build the identity of being a Christian in a sense. And it goes both ways, right? Negative and positive. We, like Terence McKenna said, we are the beings that addict. Like addiction is humanity's, like is we stick to material, right?
That's profound. That's great.
Yeah. So that's an interesting sphere to look at is what are habits without making a judgment on them.
See, our other use of the word habit is our habitat, or
mm-hmm.
what the buildings we inhabit,
which are part of our identities too. Like, you have a home, which is a macrocosm of your body, right? And
Absolutely.
The city is a macrocosm of the home, right? And this town is the macrocosm of the neighborhood, right? And then you have nested identities from a person to a state to a country, right? And we're kind of these modular beings that continuously become part of bodies, now with the internet just all the time in a sense. So I like the habitus or your habitat. That's a very, very interesting in terms of Piagetian symbolism too. So go ahead on the habits.
Certainly. Yeah. Like this is why Jordan Peterson's number one injunction is to clean your room, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's small, it's local, it's immediate, and you have bad habits as expressed by the state of disrepair that your room is in. But to inculcate the habit to clean your room is sort of conjoins your habitat and your habits into one being, you and your environment. From these two complementary definitions of you and your environment, your room is an extension of yourself in McLuhan's terms, right? So mastery over your immediate material world. And this gets back to my idea of looking at all of civilization as material and cognitive artifice against the chaos of nature. Like biology is crazy, man. Like biology and evolution and stuff. Like just hey, we found the components of a cell. We can now like render the cell as a machine. Oh no, we can't. Right? It doesn't work that way at all. Hey, DNA is like the binary code, or the code of creation. We just have to crack the DNA and we'll understand everything about human biology. No, we won't. Turns out there's epigenetics, right? Like the chaos, the amazing part of biology is it's so squishy and indefinable. And just when you think you've hammered down a pattern, some new emergent phenomenon in the chaos, screws up. It sort of mirrors our idea of the ego in the void, right?
Yeah.
All of our models of biology, all of our models of the natural world, we can't model it. It's always more chaotic than we think that our positively defined sciences can handle it, right? And so that's nature.
Yeah, I think there's a category mistake there that continuously happens. Oh, we're looking at DNA to find the essence of biology or humanity. It's not there. All right, epigenetics. Well, we got a full bore there. It's going to continue to happen if you keep, because we're trying to reduce ultimately spiritual phenomenon to their material constituent parts. It's like I have this analogy of you watch a movie, Braveheart, whatever it is, and it just pulls on your heartstrings and you start crying because you're watching it. And it's so emotional. It's like, oh man, why did I start crying? Why am I so emotional? Because let me break that TV down to its component parts. Let me break each of those components down to their chips, and let me break all those down that's how I'm going to find out why my heart is singing from watching this movie. No, that's not it. Let me take my neurons. Let me take my brain out. Let me see the firing pattern that was manifested while I just thought about my dead mother from watching that from that movie. That's going to be it. It's never going to be there. And I think this is the central theme of Peugeot's book, Language of Creation. We've effaced the spiritual, ancient, archaic understanding of being in the world, and we're just completely focused. We're not looking up, we're looking down. And this whole postmodern thing of deconstructing all metaphysical structures, while the structures become corrupt, and corruption sucks, and but we've completely, I think science, there's this huge category mistake that's been made and that you just articulated with continuously looking at whether it's DNA or biology. But then we're assuming, like you're assuming, that it's chaos. That's the reason why every time we keep looking at these different structures and not finding, or not making sense of the bigger story, the chaos is an indicator that we're missing the mark, right? And I think like with the new science here, I think maybe talking about, because I've read a couple chapters, but I understand the general theme so far. What is the new science, and how can we switch from continuously looking for the small object A, and from a scientific perspective, philosophical, psychological, psychiatric, whatever it is, we keep finding this emptiness, we keep finding this void. Like, what is the new science?
So that book is intended to be the third in a series of books. The first by Sir Francis Bacon, and the second by by Vico. I won't even try to say his first name. Yeah. Right. And implicitly, it's in reaction to the effects of the printing press, to talk about it in McLuhan's terms. And so the new science is precisely working on the material which we can reduce to its actual causal properties as a whole. All the human-made things in the world, all the artifice, all the machines, every machine has a part name, and every part was designed by some inventor whose name is written on a patent document that's filed in a filing cabinet, right? That Siegfried Gideon, architectural and art historian, spent 10 years during the war pouring through patent documents trying to reveal, hey, look, humans made our world within the bounds of civilization, within the bounds of our human-made world, right? Our material speaks the same way poetry speaks, right? Like there are intentions and purposes and reasons for being of all of our artificial objects. If we look at everything as an art, right? If we take the way we analyze paintings, or the way McLuhan analyzed a poem, or human speech, or an oratory by Cicero, or a right, we can adduce we can figure out the human meaning of that thing by breaking it down into the parts. But then when it comes to the larger picture, when it comes to nature, when it comes to the totality of being, when it comes to the questions, religion will always remain, the spiritual will always remain, right? The symbolist poets, the romantic poets drew on nature metaphors in trying to paint landscapes and arrest single perceptions of nature. So you're reading Wordsworth, or you're reading Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and they'll use a sunset, and the setting of the sun means this and this and this, right? And all these poets are drawing on nature metaphors, which have been part of human culture for our entire lives. We people are constantly saying, oh, it's the dawn of a new age, or the storm is upon us, or the flood is coming. All the experiences that we have living in nature, right, trying to please God, to make the rains come, right? How many pop songs are about a rainy day, right? Probably every Jeff Lynne song, right. So romanticism is about getting inside the head and using these nature metaphors to relate profound symbolic meaning in the way that this meaning also existed for pagan society and whatnot, right? And then you get to the symbolists, who start incorporating modern industrial scenes and actual modern day-to-day life and the components of the human, their like mundane world, which was not high art, it was low art, right? Elites wouldn't use comic books and scraps and newspaper clippings and old tin cans and you know, in their poetry, but the symbolists and then the modernists did, right? So you got T.S. Eliot's so T.S. Eliot has got this poem. Forgive me for just very quickly. The love song of Alfred J. Prufrock, and McLuhan wrote a book. It's like 180 pages analyzing this one poem by T.S. Eliot, and it after the preface it begins. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. So the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. That's a really modernist symbolist poem, right? It takes some contemporary, non-historical, weird, mundane thing, right? Somebody knocked out on laughing gas, getting ready for surgery, and juxtaposes it with the setting sun of the dawn in the evening time, right? It's like, how is the sun performing surgery on me every day? Does it mean that when to wake up and to have consciousness is to be cut into? Like the sun is a surgeon invading me, or right? He's poetically creating meaning, which imbues the real living world and mixing it with the nature metaphors, which are inherent, and creating new language and new symbolism, right? So McLuhan was extremely astute at looking at the layers and layers of meaning, how it's created by the juxtaposition of certain words. And he used the 4 levels of scriptural exegesis, which you know, the literal, the metaphorical, the tropological, and the anagogical, right? Which was taught through all the Middle Ages, right? He uses the trivium and the quadrivium, right? He meticulously studied this stuff for like a decade and a half of his life, and was applying it to language, to applying it to writings new and old, right? He saw so for all the things that Mathieu Peugeot lays out in his book as an abstract system, the language of creation, McLuhan sees the historical buildup and development of those concepts as expressed by the people innovating them and developing them, right? Abelard did this and Erasmus did that, and they got this from Cicero, right? And so the nature of the relation of symbolism with material reality, the difference between heaven and earth, when you read McLuhan's doctoral thesis, is laid out as a historical progression or an artifact which was developed by people speaking, and how they used language, and how this book was written with a focus on dialectic and being logical, and how this book was written on a emphasis of being rhetorical and persuasive, or grammatical and incisive, and poetically creating observations, right? Grammar. T.S. Eliot is being a grammarian when he sees a symbolic linkage between the setting sun and the surgeon cutting into, you know, the etherized, numbed patient of industrial society, right? Right. He's poetically reading a symbolic meaning into things that in mundanity people just, you know, dismiss as a regular routine operation. Pardon the pun.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so that's, well, that's enough of a tangent. If you have any thoughts on any of that.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, it made me think of the this idea of Deleuze has this idea of the abstract machine, and it's this way that the phenomenon of reality comes into being by these processes. This abstract machine takes flows and encodes them, and in that encoding process, qualitatively creates something new. Right. So you have water is responsible for small pebbles coming together, water and pressure, and it's forming larger rocks, and then more pressure and differences in atmosphere and temperature fuse those rocks together till eventually you get a mountain, right? So it's these flows that continuously form identities, and it's these historical flows through these nodes, through these points of different authors and different different artists and artistic creations and philosophies that are coming together, and through differentiation and repetition is continuously unifying the multiplicity in a sense. But what kind of a few things came up, like when you talk about all of this is connected through language, through the logos. Heidegger had this saying that language is the house of being, right? Language is the house of being, and it's interesting. The scripture tells us that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And you're trying to parse out what that means with the cognitive functioning of our current, abstracting apparatus, again, is almost impossible. But what you just articulated there, and I think McLuhan, rightly, is that this thread of the logos just warps and woofs through history to create this, this human artifact that we all live inside of, which now has become a machine. What happens if this logic plays out? Like, what is the end game here? What happens now?
Well, with electricity, we have become discarnate, which means our relation to our environment, our body and our immediate surroundings are cut out of the picture. There's an electrical short circuit between me and you right now. I think I'm talking to, James Cortides. I'm not. I'm sitting all alone in my bedroom, staring at a bunch of pixels, talking into a little vibrating diaphragm. A whole bunch of stuff is going on, completely below my ability to sense. Right? There's a digital analog conversion and signal compression and packet switching networks and all this interceding media. Completely, I don't know. No, I'm sitting here talking to you. We've created this space, right? It's just two guys, having a talk to our senses, right? So this pulls me out of relation to my immediate environment. I'm sucked into this high level content of thinking that, feeling. I don't think. I know better, but knowing doesn't amount to anything. Knowing about what's going on, that's concept stuff. That's a hill of beans compared to what your body feels is going on, what your participatory knowing is informing you about what's happening. And right now, I am not scared at all of saying the wrong thing and you hitting me. It's completely out of the question, right? Right. That's so like the good nature of our dialogue is not in any way informed by where you and I sitting at a bar and we had to for you and I pissed you off. The thought that you could, throw the table over and sock me one, right? Which is, of course, the literal state. Or, I might hit you too, let's be fair, I can get pretty mean. The point is though, right? Our bodies become more and more useless and accessory and ephemeral. And there's the idea of being brains in a jar, or the homuncular fallacy of dualism, of being a self, of spirit, which is directly short-circuiting through media, right? So I can sit here and I can pull open a digital audio workstation and I can pull out, a little keyboard, like this, and I can master creating music on the computer, right? Let's say, well, I'm never going to master it. It'll be horrible. But but the point is, right, so long as more and more of what we do exists in a virtual simulated cyberspace content, through which we interface at ever more at means which are ever more lifted and abstracted away from the reality of what's going on, the less we're going to incarnate and live in our bodies and feel that we're in touch with our bodies, literally. And if you and people experiencing, feeling out of touch with their sensations, or not knowing, or constantly being confused as to who and what they are, attracted to, or what it is that informs their desires that they're chasing after, is probably because they're doing so much through non-material means. And they're not, right? Like, I wouldn't say it's enough. Oh, I need to unplug, so I'm going to go camping every weekend and get back to nature. I don't think that's the shortcut. I don't think that's the straightest line towards embodiment. The straightest line to embodiment is, oh, my computer broke. I'm going to fix it myself and take it apart and train my body to know that this is a real physical thing. and that, you know, I know what it is. I'm going to take apart my material world until I know to tell the media from the content, right? I'm going to fall in love with the material world, not as a, you know, atheist materialist because I think materialism is everything, but because once you get through that, it's sort of like everyone is running a marathon without ever having learned to tie their shoes, right? We're born into a world where we're told instructions on what to do. Oh, you know, make sure your handshake is just this firm, and make sure you look this person in the eyes, and it ends up being fake because we don't know why we're doing it, right? Oh, you want to fix your computer, just click this and do that, but you don't know what you're doing. You're going through steps. We just go through steps of everything, which are out of sync with our feel for actually existing as embodied people in relation to the world, which does have meaning, because all of our artifacts have parts and names and inventors, and they work together in a system you could learn if you wanted to. Just so happens computers are extremely advanced, and it's very hard, right? It's easy for me, having lived, you know, 20 years of my life trying to take control of my own computer, to go tell you or anyone else to, you know, start on a journey that I'm, you know, 20 years advanced on. But nevertheless, the alternative is using something every day that you're not in a real embodied relationship with. You're more in relation with the ghost, the illusion of information as reified, as though files are real, and you attach them with a paperclip to an email that gets sent to the digital magical post box that doesn't really exist, right? We're interacting with the dream world made up by interface experts.
Yeah.
Right. And that's all very mundane, boring stuff that is beyond thinking about. Go leave it to the computer nerds to make a machine. I just want to make music. I don't care how the computer works. I just want to make music. Right. Well, you know, maybe the history of, I was talking yesterday to a guy who builds guitars for some of the biggest names in rock and roll. And you know, he was talking about the MIDI guitars in the 80s. Right, like these guitars which transformed the plucks into sampled guitar notes, which then you're not actually playing a guitar. All your motions are translated into what's called the digital domain, and then rendered as a MIDI file and played and whatnot. Right, that's the direction everything is going. Because the interface is no longer a microphone and a real guitar. In this particular case, not very many people play MIDI guitars, for crying out loud, but lots of people auto-tune their voices. So they're singing not necessarily with the intention to sing well as has been demonstrated to sing, right? There are amazing singers out there, but you don't have to be that good to be very pleasing to the ear. But before auto-tune, in the 60s and 70s, there was EQ, and there was adding just the right amount of reverberation, and there was all these processing tricks to make it so that the way you sung in real life and the way that the performers, artists came out on the studio album, you know, it sounded completely different. Right, for a long time we've been, you know, simulating, processing, living through media and things which more and more, right, you can make the same complaints about makeup and beauty standards, right? There's lots of very valid feminist criticism on all that stuff, etc., right? How is media processing us? And the way back for me is, you know, start with understanding the material just to get through it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's you reminded me earlier when you were talking about this came up to me, you know, pickup artists, like you've seen them on YouTube, or it's like all you have to do is play these gambits and these games and to get the girl to sleep with you, right? That's a absolutely guaranteed way to destroy relationships in your life, if that's where you're going with. So our intention, our comportment towards things is jacked up. Like when you're talking about, you know, what shows up to you as important is dealing with the material of the computer and how it operates, right? But that doesn't necessarily, everybody, you can't control what shows up as important and relevant for you. So whatever that thing is that shows up, that shines forth in the clearing, as Heidegger would say, right? That is what you need to comport yourself towards, because this isn't going away. This virtual space, it's only going to get more. We have to find, we can't stop the waves, but we can learn how to surf, right? So we have to say kind of a corny cliche, but this isn't going away. When I was talking with Andrew McLuhan, he was talking about, I'm like, so what do we do, you know, within this maelstrom? And, you know, this idea is you need to have, like you said, find that thing that shows up for you and pursue it, and then focus on your physical environment around you, but not just your physical environment, the human relationships that you have around you. This is what Christ always came back to. It's about the human heart, and it's about the relationship with others, right?
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
hard to be a nihilist when you're holding your newborn in your hand, right? Like a
Mhm.
newborn. It's almost impossible, right? And it's human relationships. I don't know do you have kids?
No, I don't.
Yeah. You have a sister that you love, right?
I do.
And
Yes.
she's in front of you and you're having a conversation. Like, that's not a simulation. There might be, you know, programs, not to use the metaphor again, playing in the background that you're thinking about work, you're thinking about this other thing, but this human to human contact and engaging with the world wholeheartedly,
Mhm.
right, is a way to, I think, to kind of get through it. And if I can find it here, there's this in the beginning of Laws of Media, McLuhan brings up this blind, um, I think he was, I don't know if he was a philosopher, and this guy was blind his entire life. And he talks about encountering a table with his hand. And the way that it was, I'll put it right here, actually. He says his name is Jacques Lusserian, Lusseyran. And I think this is relevant to kind of what we're talking about here. He says, if I put my hand on the table without pressing it, I knew the table was there, but knew nothing about it. To find out, my fingers had to bear down. And the amazing thing is that the pressure was answered by the table at once. Being blind, I thought I should have to go out and meet things, but I found that they came to me instead. I have never had to go more than halfway, and the universe became the accomplice of all my wishes. And continues here. He says, if my fingers pressed the roundness of an apple, each one with different weight, very soon I could not tell whether it was an apple or my fingers, which were heavy. I didn't even know whether I was touching it or it was touching me. As I became part of the apple became part of me. And that was how I came to understand the existence of things, right? And he's
Mm.
talking about this in the context of the alphabet, made us focus on visual space, like made the visual space apparent to us.
Mhm.
But space is really a gestalt, right? It's like this, the sensorium of
Mhm.
senses, and we're hyper focused on this visual space. And now it's been even more amplified through these media technologies of the internet, right? And
Mhm.
then social media, that when we turn this off, right, like I'm going to go and, see my wife, or my kids aren't here now, but like back into the real world, like, back in Zion, right? Plug back into the matrix.
Mhm. Mhm.
And
Mhm.
my wife,
Mhm.
like when all that happened and I went down and like, Trump got kicked off Twitter, and you had the Capitol was raided by the neo-pagan shaman guy, right?
Mhm.
I come
Yeah.
home and my wife she's an ICU nurse, right? Could care less about those things. Doesn't have a Twitter account, barely on Facebook. So I'm coming home. Hey, babe, they kicked Trump off of Twitter. These big tech companies, they're taking over whatever it is. And it's like, it dawned on me. I'm like, that's not real. It's just not real. Like we take it as real, and we invest our desire in it, but it's
Mhm.
not real. Like when you go back and play with my kids, or you go out back and whatever it is that you do to root yourself into the real world, that has to be a huge part of the equation, because you're going to keep dipping into the matrix, right? But we need
Mhm.
people that are rooted in the real world and then are engaging with the matrix, and you can do, that's what has to happen. Like I was talking with Andrew McLuhan, he's like, read a book. Don't read a book online. Read an actual tangible book.
Mhm.
Paint. Go out into nature and observe, and then write some poetry that comes to mind. Like you have
Mhm.
to do these things now. They're necessary to buttress the impact of these all of these lights flashing at us at different rates all the time, all day,
Mhm.
24/7. And McLuhan talks about this. We're re-entering acoustic space, where and we don't have the kind of wiring, the kind of ability to navigate in it. But we're going to have to develop these competencies. We're going to have to develop these skills, and it's not going to be everybody develops it at once and moves to the new. It's going to be, and I don't want to sound elitist here, it's going to be certain people that can be like barometers, that can be compasses, that can be way showers, and not in a sense of not telling people what to do, but doing it, showing it, and having that ripple out. Like I think we have to act local, think globally, but act local. Get involved in your community. Like go, what I'm
Mhm.
saying, get involved with people in your community, and that's been lost. And then if you get into the whole geopolitical situation of this. So I'm getting back into the matrix now, of this wealth extraction from the middle class in the United States and across the globe, everywhere, right? And we're continuously being refocused to look at situations like white privilege and racism, which are real things, right? But it's like the real action is happening. Like the environment that recedes in the background is making all of us focus at each other. Like it's like the working class people that are causing all these political issues, when people like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates are getting hyper rich, like ungodly amounts of money. I think Bill Gates is the largest landowner in America. Elon Musk was just made was the richest man in the world. And these things should be alarming. And it's like, oh man, yeah, he's making a lot of money. What happened to antitrust laws, where these resources are being extracted out of human being and their relationships with others to these abstract tech conglomerates, the technology, medical, industrial complex. So like we've just entered the matrix again. We were just talking about, being with family and doing things that you love, but quickly we're back into the thing that's happening everywhere. And that's so alarming and whatnot. This is parallax thing. You got to kind of do both. But that kind of brings me to questions like, what is a metapolitics? Like, we have metaphysics, and we can think of, all these different areas that we can have hyper conversations. I have this group on Facebook called the Hyperconversation. It seems like politics is stuck in this weird, stale, calcified state. He had Kanye come in. Kanye was very interesting, and I think he said he's trying to innovate or bring this whirlwind that has changed things so rapidly around us, but politics has stayed the same. How can we understand the political situation, and what is the perspective from across the fence there in Canada of the American political situation, and what do we do?
Yes, well, your news builds on yesterday's news, which builds on news from the day before, and the contemporary language of discussing the narrative and who controls the narrative, which has become the way that lots of people who are skeptical now of reporting, describe the narrative. And then they'll go so far as to talk about timelines. Like, this timeline, man, this timeline is crazy compared to that time, right? Or we live in different worlds, but say like Democrats and Republicans and whatnot.
Echo chambers, to use that metaphor,
Absolutely.
Echo chambers,
Absolutely. So there's a very interesting, I like your metaphor of parallax, because you're in the matrix and then you're back in Zion, say. Zion being the human embodied scale, where again things are proportionate. It's really important that you get healthy food on the table. It's not so important if you don't paint over that thing on the wall that is annoying, but it's not a priority. Right. There's proportionality to your priorities in your embodied day-to-day life when you're living with your family and your community. And then now you've got your large scale, macro scale geopolitical idea of what's important. It's super important that we don't go to war again in the Middle East, right? Yeah. I mean, right. So switching back and forth, the fact that we have to try and inhabit these spaces, one of which is embodied, one of which is entirely mediated to us, right? And the juncture, the joining, the proper way to connect these two worlds, I think, is through an investigation of the history of how the media grew and how it is that citizens in their little vernacular world of their tribe, where outside of the borders of their village there be dragons, and every once in a while a sailor came along with crazy stories of unicorns in North America, right? Right. And then you discover the rhinoceros exists 100 years later or whatever, right? And you're like, oh, he was right the whole time. We all thought that guy was crazy, right? So we the entire story, the entire development of humans living as totally embodied beings, to then gradually becoming more and more interconnected and having this awareness at this massive, super colossal geopolitical scope, and also this microscopic atomic scope of from Democritus talking about atoms all the way through Einstein and general relativity, and right, the fact that our world, as we try and sense it, is blown apart and fractured at all these different levels that we can't integrate and properly prioritize across these broken strata, right? So understanding that, before the telegraph, newspapers didn't show up every day with little disjointed stories about what was happening all over the place all at once, and the readers in the 1880s, the French poet Mallarmé observed, were trying to create a story of the world out of a whole bunch of little disconnected elements which comprised a symbol, and that symbol was the world as a whole. That was Mallarmé's insight, is that the fact that this newspaper has a story about this happening in Germany and that happening in Britain and this happening in the colonies or whatever, right? All juxtaposed every day. We were using our intuitive symbolic sense to get the picture of the greater world, right? And it's precisely because there wasn't an editor who's writing, who's trying to explain how everything relates. It was left to the human imagination to picture one world out of these fractured, right, elements, right?
So Mark McLuhan says that the devil is an electrical engineer, right? And the ruler of this world is diabolical, right? So the opposite of symbolic, right? The inverse of symbolic is diabolic, right? And diabolos, is the devil. Literally, the devil is the defragmentator that's giving you false perceptions of meaning. That's giving you intuitive hits that this is the world as it is. But he can't create anything, right? All he can do is manipulate the truth. And it's manipulated, and our senses are attuned to this manipulation where we think that we're getting meaning. And the meaning crisis is because it's all empty. So we're getting all these meaning by trying to put these fragments together, but they're being arranged in such a way that it's empty. And that's why I think that that's a big part of the meaning crisis, right? So these, we started just talking about the devil again, right? Like, this, there are forces like this that are manipulating human emotions and human relationships in order to keep the truth hidden. And it seems like there is,
I think so. If two people are sitting beside each other in Plato's cave, and they're talking about themselves and they're talking about the world that they live in, they can be having a real human connection. And they're co-participating in what the person who escaped the cave is looking at is a collective delusion, right? And then the devil's creating the delusion, the falsity of the world. So you have these two individuals talking to each other and communing within what ultimately always is the void we were discussing earlier, because the world that they're trying to co-create and perceive together, they're trying to build a perception of the world together, which itself is, in our example, built up of content and symbols which don't add up to anything, right? A whole bunch of normalizing. Yeah, they seem to. But the essence of communication, if you think about it, is not me trying to understand you, right? We have all these models, these theories of mind. Are you what's your zodiac sign there, James?
Yeah,
right,
Capricorn.
Right.
Yeah,
You're a Capricorn. I'm a Sagittarius. So now we're right. So right. I don't even know. I'd have to ask my friends what the hell that even means. But
me too. That's a good point, though. It's right? a good point.
People are always trying to come together by understanding one another. But the way to commune is to, I'm going to show you what it is that you don't see, what your relevance realization isn't presenting to you, but it presents to me, and we're going to look at our environment together, and then you're going to show me what it is you see going on, and we will inevitably grow closer together by not focusing on one another, but by focusing on creating a more stable, grounded perception of our world and bringing each other into our perception of the world and the right proportions and priorities, right? Like etc. So it's precisely that's why I stress, if I teach people how computers work, it's about them seeing all the ramifications in their life that, this machine was not salient to them except as a means to type up their resume and to play a video game and to Skype with their grandmother, right? But now, to see it as a thing itself and understand, that Dennis Ritchie invented the first portable computer programming language in the 70s, C, right? Like before that, a computer program was written for a specific piece of hardware, and you wanted to write a new computer program, you had to learn how that hardware worked. And every computer was different, and every software only ran on that computer because it was written for that computer, right? So let's
Wow.
abstract the hardware away and make a portable computer programming language, such that if you write a program in C, a compiler will compile it for any computer, right?
So
then nowadays every video gamer understands what it means to port a game from a PS4 to an Xbox, right, or whatever. But these are human-made things with particular importance, and these aren't floating in abstract cyberspace,
yeah.
right? If you understand the materiality of it and the intentions behind it.
It seems like that's a direct microcosm of what happened with language, right? Hieroglyphic language, symbolic language was based on, it was for a purpose. It was for things in the world. They reflected in, so this idea that programming language had this effect of being for particular hardware purposes. And then this language is abstracted, just like the alphabet was meaningless phonemes, right? But it's so used. The same thing just happened there with C. I saw you know what I'm saying? Develop this language C and then C+, which just, amplified the 2,000 year effect of the phonetic alphabet, was, compressed into few decades.
Yes.
And that
Yes,
compression,
exactly.
and it's continuing to happen. And it's fascinating, man. And I think to stick to your point a little bit here, I think it's more important that you share honestly what you're passionate about. When you talk to someone and they're talking about what they're passionate about, you're engaged, even if you don't know about the subject matter, like you're pulled into that. So when you're talking about computers and the background and the media landscape of computers themselves, I get drawn into that because you're talking about it, because you're passionate about it, because it's something that you love, right? And I will be interested in it and want to learn, not because I'm particularly interested in computers, but wow, he's on fire. His soul is speaking when he's speaking to me. He's channeling true information. And I think that's an important piece, and to share what you're passionate about. And I think we have this superego, or this like self-conscious thing in our heads that keeps us from doing that. It goes back to the point of it's almost impossible to be real at work. You said in the bartender, but it's not just bartenders, it's the corporate environment itself. Which again just came to me. This is like a microcosm of, so media is what mediates. It's what's in between communion, right? If it's in between us, right? Is this media, the medium, the thing that's in between us. Another layer of that is at work, right? There's a medium, the corporation and the HR and the rules and the policies and procedures and SOPs and whatnot. So there's this medium in between you, so you can't have proper communion. You can't have, it's hard, very hard to have authentic relationship at work, and it's obvious to everyone now. That's why, you even have specialists that come into corporations and talk about meaning and talk about, that are like trying to, pick up people into having meaningful work at a job that they hate. And it's not going to work anymore. And why isn't it working now? It worked for so long. This is this idea of the apocalypse, right? The apocalypse is things being revealed that were once hidden, right? So you see the media continually trying to use their old tricks to whatever it may be, election fraud or whatever it is. And it's not like there is specific fraud that happened now that didn't happen before. The whole thing's been fraudulent, but now things are being revealed and they're ugly and they're going to continue to proliferate and be revealed. But I think we are living in an apocalypse in the sense of this old world is melting. It's going away, and the new world is emerging, right? We're living through a renaissance. But the people that live through a renaissance, they're not like, oh, a new beautiful world is coming. It's like, oh, all the structures that I've relied on my entire life are crumbling around me. It's like we are in this transition space between the old and the new. And the ideas of game B, Jordan Hall and John Vervaeke, you're always talking about this game B, and I love it. But my question, I want to have Jordan Hall on, and my question to you too is, as you said it, I wanted to read a little bit about a quote, an article that you wrote here. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Yeah. So he said, we all live in the same giant machine surrounded by mirage and illusion crafted to carry us from cradle to grave through its well-worn pathways. The path only exists insofar as we are ignorant of its existence within our minds as the interpretations of marks on the wall, signs on paper, or mosaics of flickering radiant light. Taking in the content without taking in the machine tribalizes us into real union with false consciousness of the means or criteria for the binding. What is the binding? In game B, right? Oh, we all want to be, what is the thing that's going to cohere and bind people together? Communism sounds great on paper, right? Communism doesn't have the binding mechanism of religion, right? Christ is what unifies the multiplicity, right? But even saying Christ now, it's people just apply, what they saw on TV about it, right? So Christ is the what unifies the multiplicity. What is going to unify a game B group or game B crowd? What is going to unify people? And I don't know the answer to this. I think the answer is Christ, but it in a whole, I don't even know what that really means, right? Like if you have right relationship to Christ and to God, right? First of all, you have to consider he exists again. Then you have to develop a relationship again. And doing so, doing it the right way, how can you tell if you're doing something the right way? And how do you watch out for the dangers of becoming a suicide bomber? Like, you know what I'm saying? There's a lot of pitfalls that can happen when you're dealing in this space. The way you can tell how it's acting in your life is the fruits, right? Are your relationships with your family, with your friends, with your community, with your work life, right? What is the nature of those relationships, right? If those are continuously getting better and you are providing and receiving value for more and more people, and that value is spreading out in your community, right? You are living appropriately, and that's going to ripple out, and that's what's going to help build the new. But I think it comes back to this idea of, the two main commandments are to love God with all of your heart and to love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus was like, all right, here, these two, if you just do these two, love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself, right? Those are the two things. We've completely destroyed God. God is dead, right? We've stopped even considering that he exists. And now there's all these new age, return to paganism, like, all this religion stuff is coming back, the whole, what we're seeing, like the Q movement, and what you saw at the Capitol, and you're seeing with something like Black Lives Matter, and not criticizing Black Lives Matter. I'm just saying that, like, they had icons of George Floyd, they had kneeling, they had, reparations, like all of this is, you try to cut off this thing that's, that is absolutely fundamental to being, you try to cut it off, it's going to pop up monstrously, in many different ways. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing. But I guess that rant is centered around, what is the binding agent for us to cohere on?
Right. Well, if the phrase, the aphorism, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd thought of one of, which popped into mind a few weeks ago, which is the road to hell is bushwhacked by expediency.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So
it's Petersonian. It says, don't do what's expedient, do what's meaningful. Yeah.
Right. If there's a criticism to be made of well-intended activism within the language that we've been developing in our conversation so far, it would be a disproportionate focus and emphasis and passion for immediate, ends by any means, and a refusal to rightly commune with those who have a completely different priorities or focus, or who are trying to conserve something which, in the apocalyptic sense, they see as melting away too soon. The fact that everyone renders their immediate world differently, and B, their total world, whether that be their state or their country or the planet as a whole, or they humans' relations with the aliens at a scope larger than that, right, in some material sense, right, or even, of course, actual devout faith in religion, whatever it is you're prioritizing and emphasizing, right, you're chasing your object appétit at through what it is you are transfixed on, as if we fix this, everything else is downhill, and other problems will fix themselves after we fix this one thing, right. The fact that people are bound through through their what they share together in their tribe as the one thing they worship as the linchpin against which, fix this thing, we'll stop the apocalypse. All right, fix this thing, and that'll satiate the monster that's going to eat us all.
Girardian. You read Girard? Rene Girard?
I skimmed. I've read lots of synopses, as is the way of us internet people who seldom read full text. But yeah.
You just encapsulated the scapegoat concept perfectly, right? Like Trump is a great foil to bring people together in the worst way, but he brings people together, right? He's gone. What's next? It's something going to fill that gap. Something's going to fill that void, right? Another ideology. I'm afraid it's going to be Trump supporters. I'm afraid it's going to be the 70 million, and then it's going to get really hairy. But I think your point is, you can make the first command is do not make idols. It's like, why would God care if you make idols? That means you don't. Ideology is inherent, right? You can make an ideology out of anything. Wealth, money, the golden calf, sex, porn, television, movies, Netflix, social justice issues, religion, Christianity. All of these things can be made idols. And the history of Christianity is such that, and I would look at the church and be like, why would people go to church? They're disingenuous people. They go to church and their lives are falling apart. Why would I do that? The church is bullshit. The whole Christian thing is bullshit because it's become an ideology, right? It's been manipulated and twisted that the more true a thing is, the more the diabolical forces will twist that truth, right? And the more yourself, the more you're going after the truth, the more your passions will start being inflamed. It's like when they see you, he's trying to pray, he's trying to find God, increase addiction, increase these things to, keep him from doing that in a sense. So I think you're right on to point to this endemic quality of ideology, and Zizek wrote a book, The Sublime Object of Ideology. The sublime object of ideology. What does sublime mean? That's a religious, uncanny type of idea. And I think that's right with the object petite a. It's this false light that shines. And once you get it, the light goes away and then you're not satiated and the light is somewhere else now. And it's the next thing, the next toy, the next iPhone, in a sense. That part is that's being short-circuited.
I love that you mentioned that, because I was about to say, remember how the iPod Nano came in all these great colors, right? And it was, when it was marketed, what was actually beautiful about the colors was the spectrum when they were all side by side in the commercial or in the display case. But when you buy one and you take it home, it's just blue. That blue isn't, the marketing makes it look a beautiful shade of blue precisely because of its placements in the larger schema, right?
100%.
So, there's this idea of the beauty of a figure within its proper grounding there. If you don't mind, I'll circle back, because there's something extremely important in the fact that you made the metaphorical leap to comparing the C programming language as a portable computing language back to the Toronto school Innes and Havelock idea that Rome could only conquer and become an empire because of the phonetic alphabet. Because no matter who they encountered, they could take the phonemes, like the sounds being uttered by that oral tribe, and render it into their one alphabet with the same letters, right? So they what the Egyptians wouldn't be able to go hear a foreign tongue and then render that language within hieroglyphics, because hieroglyphics was not a phonetic language. The fact that A, B, C, D are connected to abstract sounds, which can then consume and in a universal sense take over and submerge foreign languages within the one same written code, facilitated the growth of empire of the phonetic alphabet. And precisely, the C programming language has been the basic systems language for all computers since the 70s, since it was invented. Now, you made that observation because I explained to you something real about computers, an actual historical thing that happened. When I say that people use machine metaphors to describe themselves, people 150 years ago or 100 years ago, they understood how a steam engine worked, right? You boil the water, the pressure builds up. So the metaphor, Freud's metaphor based on drives, was true. It was like an actual process, mechanical process. the metaphors people use from computers today are all based on false high-level illusions, or right, they say, oh, he's trying to multitask, and that's a bad, right, you shouldn't multitask, you should stay focused on one thing and not do too many things, right? We're using computer metaphors today that aren't based on how computers actually work. Like multitasking is not a real thing. It's a way to draw a bunch of windows and have them execute in time slices broken up throughout the clock cycle, right? It's not real. We don't use the real machine metaphors anymore because no one understands. Well, very few, the people who give us language on how to apply these metaphors to our life are using the high level content false identity of machines, of our contemporary machines, to do so. Multitasking isn't real. So to describe someone as a multitasker is implicitly to bind them to an illusory artifact that was made up by someone whose job it was to make computers so easy that even grandma could use them, right?
To bind yourself to the simulation.
Bind yourself to the simulation.
And then the simulation of the simulation. Like we're living like the stacked simulacrums stacked on each other to bring Baudrillard in, and we're anchoring our identities into these things that aren't real. Like I'm just going to say maybe, they're not real, but they're not fake. They're just less real. Like we're getting farther and farther away from reality. Like the steam engine, that was closer to the elements of water, and you know what I'm saying? And so saying I'm under pressure is true, because you're under pressure. You feel the pressure just like a pipe feels it. Like I feel like I'm about to burst, right? So there's a cohesion there, but now we're abstracting layers and layers from that. And I think
you become Major Tom, right?
Yeah.
It's like ground control to Major Tom. Where are you going, right? And if you look at remix culture and whatnot, and right, like ever since Joseph Campbell refined this universal heroes myth out of, I guess, the Golden Bough or James Fraser, right. And now people build stories based on this highly refined thing, which sort of, its origins has been covered up, because all you got to do is go read, the Hero with 1,000 Faces, and it's got everything in it. And then,
that's like the alphabet. That's like the phonetic alphabet process, right? He took all of these specific, meaningful stories that were in a time and place, abstracted them out, and created a phonetic alphabet of the universal hero story, and which is...
You got the wise old man. Here are the archetypes. Just use all these archetypes. It's the full panoply of human being, and write your story and go, right?
And it's not that they're false. It's that they're abstracted from this rich texture culture of where they came from. You know what I'm saying? It's not that they're false, but they're superficial. In a sense, that's what our movies are based off of. That's what entertainment's based off of. And what we see now is we see just this rehashing of 80s and 90s tropes and movies and videos. You just saw Mike Tyson and Mike Tyson and Roy Jones fight, right? Mike Tyson. And who was doing the intro? It was AC Slater. It was from Saved by the Bell, right? And they had Snoop Dogg performing there. They're just regurgitating parts of our history where things were more real. They were pretty superficial, but to us, like, it's really nostalgic. I love 80s music and 90s culture because that was more real. Not saying that, you know what I'm saying? So we've it's gotten so hyper simulated so quickly, where the 90s seems very real when the 90s was still a kind of a simulated consumer space. But in just 20, 30 years later, you're like, oh my God, things have ramped up so quickly. We're looking to anchor reality back into the 80s and 90s. All right, just give me that like shit. It's like, it's kind of crazy. And you just, you said when you're talking about the language, the C language or C plus, like, and the idea that the alphabet is like teeth, McLuhan says, and you called it consumer, like consumes us. And what are we? We're consumers. We're in consumerism. Right. It's like this whole idea of the phonetic alphabet has led us to this kind of hyper marketing HR environment that we live in. And McLuhan was, and I don't know how much time you have. I mean, we've kind of a little bit over. If you want to go a few more minutes.
I can hang in for a while longer for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess McLuhan was really engaged with the advertising agencies, but he wasn't all bore in with them. Like, he was at a distance, because he saw what was happening. Can you shed some light on his relationship to advertising?
So, in Time and Western Man, And also, I think in The Art of Being Ruled, the English artist Wyndham Lewis, he wrote these books in 1925, 1926. McLuhan was only 12 years old when these books came out, right? But he Lewis looks back at a quote from the socialist Charles Fourier, who was writing in the 1800s, like maybe like 1795, 1805, around there. And Charles Fourier was complaining that all the poets of the age, whose job it was to, you know, create art and poetry, were selling out to commerce and stockbrokers and writing about poetically about commodity prices. Oh, pork bellies are soaring. Oh, you know, soaps are flying off the handle. Oh, this is plummeting, right? He was complaining about art poets using fancy marketing language and rhetoric, which ought to be reserved, of course, for, you know, sermons and rendering glory unto God and instilling virtue within the masses. Right, the artist's job is to create art, which guides society. But no, they're all, you know, pimping different stocks so as to affect market prices, so that financiers can get rich. And that's like 200 years ago. Artists are selling out, right?
Yeah.
And so this is advertising. You're creating the world which Marx not entirely wrongly saw as, you know, creating the alienated person, because now now capitalism has divorced people from the true value of things and instead affixes a price to it, which the value of the things they buy and the value of the things that they create are totally out of whack. And this alienates the person from the value of anything, because marketers, well, here's what Marx didn't stress, is that marketers and advertisers and artists were upstream of this, right? Their use of language and marketing is what created the environment where now capitalism could thrive as a system. It wasn't the money per se that was the ground of things. It was the use of language and art and the dissemination of media, which was the ground of alienation. I'll posit as a tentative fundamental for what we're getting at. But McLuhan used magazine advertisements in his classroom, in his English classroom, as a way to try and this is in the 30s and 40s. He had books and books of ads that he cut out of magazines, right? That he analyzed using the techniques he was teaching his students to use on poetry. So they'd be reading, you know, books and literature and all these and you know, Byron and Dante and stuff, and then he'd pull out, you know, this Time magazine article for a wristwatch or for something, and he'd say, look, and you can use these techniques for all arts, right? And he was trying to awaken his students to an immediate ability to understand how all the artistic concepts which we inherited through our civilized culture, and from ultimately you know, the West as a whole, through the language of the Logos and the levels of exegesis through the development of sermons and interpretation of scripture, have a continuous form of being which goes under very many names, which became artistic processes, which became now the use of, you know, creating subliminal advertisements, right? There's a common set of techniques going by very many names, which shares a continuity through this story, going through this centuries. And that's what McLuhan was keyed into, was finding the unity of the story of how rhetoric and grammar and dialectic are these processes which are present in all art across, you know, whether it's a sculpture or a painting or something trying to, you know, get you to buy, you know, a new car.
He was creating an anti-environment in his class,
right.
there, right? You just, boom, you're showing something that is out of whack to point to this invisible environment that we live in, it seems like, right? This kind of idea of anti-environment. Beautifully said, well said. And I guess maybe we can leave at this point. So the idea of the tetrad is that, you know, the medium is, you know, something is retrieved, something is amplified. When something is pushed to its extreme, to the limit, it flips. How do we flip advertising? Like, how do we leverage these technologies and utilize the method of advertising, which makes things shiny, right? And makes things important and appealing. how do we leverage that or flip that to make it, to make it informative again, instead of disinformative, right? Instead of getting disinformation by being tricked, mesmerized to buying shit we don't need. How can we trick and mesmerize ourselves maybe to loving each other more, being interested, what I'm saying? How do we use these tools, social media, marketing, advertising? How do we short circuit them, flip them to make us coherent again?
In the 50s, McLuhan was at great pains to prove to society that advertisements could be considered art at all, right? I think Jonathan Pageau, in his conversation with you, when he's describing the splits that modernism created, he explicitly pointed out the split between highbrow and lowbrow culture, right? So you have high arts, and then you have the crap that we ignore, right? Penny dreadful schlock and comic books. So that was McLuhan's job, is to try and get people to look at advertisements as art and worthy of serious artistic, understanding at all. And now we've come a long way since then. Everybody is excited to see what the new Super Bowl commercial is going to be. We actually admire advertisements as art now, and everyone fancies themselves a critic on it. And if you look at the past 2 years, if you look at the way in which corporations have used their advertisements or used their voice to back social issues like Black Lives Matter, and then there's all these conversations about about that, to put it short, we now appreciate advertisements as the art form that they are. But again, even though it's this expressed in completely different conceptual language, understanding that the processes behind advertisements are the processes behind art. And so when you say, how do we use advertisements, what you're saying is, how do we create art?
Wow. Yeah. Never thought of it like that. Yeah. Beautiful. Like, I never thought of it like that. How do we do it?
Yeah. You by creating art, which I'd claim, this is my own biased opinion as the computer nerd, right? We create art that shows people what their immediate environment is made out of and puts them back in the here and now, where the people around them are relevant to them more so than the flickering images on a screen, right? I don't write for the people around you, and this can suck if you feel alienated, if you're like a gay kid growing up in some red state who's terrified to admit to your parents that you're gay. You just want to get the hell out of there, right? Like, everyone feels alienated from the people that they're surrounded by, which is precisely why they instead dive into media and find subcultures which are mediated to them, and then move to the city and go join a group or whatever, right? So somehow there's like a catch-22 process where you have to get people to feel like they belong where they're at.
Yeah. If you're in a prison, you want to know that you're, if you're in a situation that's bad and it's affecting your life, it's going to be hard to look at it, but then you can make a decision. You develop agency and sovereignty to make a decision about that environment. If you're not aware of it, and you're, unfortunately, you're a gay kid with a terrible family, and it'll ruin your life. But if you can address it, even if you leave, or there's some kind of cathartic moment where they accept you, you have to lean into it. So I think you're right. I think that's
media helps to connect people who are far apart. But when you're next to someone, you don't have to spend all your time hanging out watching Netflix. You don't need the media. You're with them now. And the environment that you're focusing on, that you're discussing, needn't be the large geopolitical scale environment. You can literally talk about, like, I sit at the bar with I got a bunch of construction worker friends who will point out to me, look at that shoddy cabinet making over there, or look at that, right? And I would go focus on your material world and get grounded there in an embodied sense before you start trying to change trying to draw people into your conception of a total world picture, which is beyond the reach of both of you physically right now, right? There's some sort of trick around that point, I think.
Yeah, I think it speaks to, the idea that that construction worker is sharing with you what he's passionate about, and this mundane thing of the shoddy woodwork, right? Which would you care about that? That stood out to you, right? Why did it? Because this person is sharing a part of their being with you, no matter how mundane it might seem in the abstract, but in the real, it's something that's meaningful and something that was memorable to you. So a lot of great insights, man. A lot of good stuff to chew on here. You've given me. I really appreciate it. And then again, kind of your last point reminded me of that Wyndham Lewis quote of, the artist is writing a detailed history of the future because he's the only one that can live in the present, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it goes back to this idea of be aware in your environment and create or encounter anti-environments to wake you up so you can see your environment and then go from there. At least do that, so yeah, man, we've definitely gone over, but fascinating conversation. I've gotten a lot from it. Anything else you'd like to share? I'm going to post and link to a lot of your content and to your new explorations journal. We didn't even kind of get into that, for my audience. Anything else you want to kind of leave us with?
Next time. Only to suggest that, we've opened a whole bunch of avenues for people to research. We've dropped a lot of names. I would like to stress, read the source materials.
Mm-hmm.
McLuhan's hard to read. Read his books. Don't go read his Wikipedia article. Don't write. If you want to investigate the world as we've been trying to lay it out, get to the ground, get to the origin, get to the source. Go read some T.S. Eliot before you go and read, the Cole's Notes version or McLuhan's interpretation of T.S. Eliot, right? That's the sort of habit, the first habit, which we're badly trained to have on the internet, is to try to go for the shortcut summary Cole's Notes version. If you can get past that, you're going to open into a wild world of new perception and new relevance realization just by swimming against that tide. So that's my first practical tip for everyone.
But be careful, because I tried to do that with this, right? So I came at it blind. I didn't know what it was at all. I'm like, oh man, McLuhan keeps referencing it. Let me get it. And I just opened to the first page. I got through half a paragraph. Half a paragraph.
I've got lots of friends.
Holy smokes. Okay, I'll put this down.
The people, man. The circles that I'm running in now, lots of these guys are members of weekly or bi-weekly Finnegan's Wake reading groups where they all sit together. They spent 15 years reading that book, and then they'll spend 3 hours on one page tussing it out. So you jump into the deep end there. You should start with the Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man.
Hook me up with those groups. Have you read Finnegan's Wake or parts of it? I don't even think you can read it.
I've tried, and you have to read it out loud first and foremost, because when you say it out loud, you realize that every sentence had 27 different spellings that were possible to make you say the same words, and it's the fact that every sentence is actually 27 different sentences full of rhymes. That's the secret of the book, is that it's completely oral. It's a completely spoken, resonant book written in. You read the one sentence out loud in a fake Irish brogue. Of course, you have to affect a fake Irish accent when you read it out loud. And you realize that you just said 6 different things at the same time. Also, if you're looking for an anti-environment to understand the art history from Camille Pallia's Sexual Personae, great book. I didn't go to school to study art history, but reading Sexual Personae gives you the overview of Western art history, so as to then have, a grounding for which to then study art history at large. So that would be my practical advice. And thank you so much for having me on your podcast. It's been absolutely delightful talking.
We'll have to do it again. Maybe we can do a little bit on Finnegan's Wake, because it just made me think he's creating an anti-environment to the alphabet, to the to the phonetic alphabet. Like, what I'm saying? Short circuits you right when you watch it, man. So lots more to talk about, but I really appreciate it, man. Thank you so much. And we'll have part 2, definitely.
Awesome.
Thanks, man. Take care. God bless. Yep.